Well, welcome everyone to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm the director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security here. Yesterday, the Council convened an off-the-record war game, as we call it, on the future of the U.S.-led coalition's operations and strategy against ISIS. This was the third and final installment of a series of war games on this topic that were convened by our senior fellow for Middle East Security in the Scowcroft Center, Bilal Saab, who will offer a few more details immediately after my introductory remarks. This installment was conducted in partnership with the Washington Post. The war games in general have been aimed to inform policy decisions and planning decisions as events continue to develop, and the key goal, obviously, is how do we best confront the strategic challenge presented by ISIS and related events in the region. In recent weeks, although, as I said yesterday, this statement could be said at any time in the last year, but in recent weeks, we have been reminded at how developments on the ground can continue to present new surprises and can have pretty far-reaching implications, both for global, regional, and more local circumstances, and that the scope of this challenge that we're discussing today is anything but local, even though initially that was the pundits' consensus. Russia's entrance is the new big variable, but I'll probably be standing up here in front of you in about a month saying there's another new variable. But this is a key one that will be durable, and I think we'll be looking to center a good deal of the discussion on what does this mean for the strategy, what does it mean for ISIS, and for all of the related questions that many of you know quite well. So it certainly has presented new complicating factors, and it clearly is preventing more significant progress on the U.S. Stated goal of degrading and ultimately destroying ISIS. Meanwhile, the refugee question also is obviously extraordinarily prominent, and they're a reminder of I think an important reminder of the human toll that the conflict has taken over more than 4 years, but also of the challenges that the conflict continues to present, and in many ways one of the real negative implications of policy choices. I mean, we're seeing these play out on a daily and weekly basis. So today's discussion also comes in the context of a broader body of work in the think tank community in Washington, and certainly at the Atlantic Council. At the Atlantic Council, there's a major and really interesting task force led by Steve Hadley and Madeleine Albright on Middle East strategy. And the purpose of that task force is to develop a framework for thinking about the region's challenges and opportunities. And I think this is really important, and certainly we in the Scowcroft Center think this is really important. If you're responding to developments only with policy choices that are not linked to a longer-term strategy and hopefully a shared set of strategic objectives between the United States and its key allies and partners in the region, then you don't know whether those policy responses are going to help you achieve your goals or whether they will lead to further crisis management choices. Mr. Hadley, who spends a lot of time with us in the Scowcroft Center on strategy, says that if all you do is manage crises, all that will do is give you more crises to manage. You need to take a strategic viewpoint. And so we're really looking forward to the results of this strategy effort. The next key event in that is a public event on October 22nd, where the security recommendations of the strategy task force will be rolled out. So please mark that on your calendars. And then the Scowcroft Center, we're also engaged in a body of work on Gulf security, a proposed U.S. approach to defense strategy in the Gulf was published earlier this year. We convened around the Camp David Summit, both before and after, and we're continuing to track that work. And then the South Asia Center, Barbara Slavin, who's here, has done an enormous body of work on Iran over the years and led an Iran task force that the Council is also continuing to follow up on. And so this is not a one-off event. It comes in the context both of developments in the region, but also as part of the Council, the Atlantic Council's wide and longstanding work on these questions. And so I think with that, I will turn it to Bilal Saab, who will offer some additional insights on this effort. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. The ISIS threat is effectively growing or the same, which is, I'm not sure what's the difference. If you don't think 3 simultaneous terrorist attacks in 3 different continents is a cause for alarm, I'd say you take a look at the movements. Expanding influence in areas like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, I would say Yemen and Libya and other places. And that means one thing and one thing only. We are due for a comprehensive review of the administration's strategy. I'll say that one more time. We are due for a comprehensive review of the administration's strategy against ISIS. We can continue to step up our kinetic efforts, but the overall plan, to the extent that one is discernible, lacks clear strategic guidance. Killing one bee at a time when you're dealing with a massive beehive is not exactly sound strategy. The president did admit in an interview on July 7 that this is a long-term campaign. He made no hints, however, of reconsideration of the existing strategy, and he did not make any hints of adjusting to existing grim realities. The United States needs to do that, and needs to do that immediately. So this is where our efforts at the Scowcroft Center come in, and Barry has mentioned that. Just yesterday we conducted the 3rd war game on ISIS, where we looked at the issue much more strategically than we have done thus far. The first 2 were a bit more operational, tactical. This one was much more strategic, and we looked at it basically 10 years ahead, 2025. Where would we like to be in Iraq and Syria in 10 years from now? And of course, equally important, how can we get there using 5-year strategies? Let me provide some key takeaways, and then we'll invite the other co-panelists. The first one, I think, which is the most important, and it was not surprising at all, there was unanimous consensus that the main problem we're dealing with here is a systemic failure of governance and lack of political legitimacy in the Arab world. This was, yes, a war game about ISIS, but not surprisingly, most of the discussion focused on the futures of Syria and Iraq as countries, and not so much on ISIS per se. You know, in many ways, the design of the war game, which is, like I said, more long-term, more strategic, allowed this to happen, and that's exactly one of the objectives that I wanted from that war game, for us to think a bit more proactively and stop thinking and reacting to little things all the time. We certainly did not disrespect the group's military capabilities, and we didn't treat it as a footnote. But we all agreed that this was really a symptom of a much deeper problem, and unless we deal with that deeper underlying challenges, then we're not going to get very far as the ISIS challenge. You start doing the right things in Iraq and Syria, and you effectively commit to helping end the civil wars in both countries, and we're going to have a chance to discuss that in length. And I bet you will start seeing instant and much more significant progress in that campaign against the organization. So the 3 broad plans that we discussed yesterday, which the United States could be pursuing in the next 10 years, are as follows. You can stay the course. Pretty much you do whatever you've been doing until now. You can get a little bit more serious with a diplomatic surge, so you focus much more on diplomacy to end the civil wars, or you can adopt heavy military intervention. Some participants yesterday called it heavier military intervention or military occupation, but the point is that in many ways you up significantly the military effort in both countries. We're not going to get into details right now how many troops, but there would definitely be a ground troop component to it. As you can imagine, these are not distinctly, entirely distinct plans. There was There's an effort by the participants yesterday, again, not surprising, to hybridize, some of these plans, especially the second one and the third one. And it's a matter of sequencing, right? The way you get to successful diplomacy is by changing events on the ground, by changing the military dynamics in a way that would make them favorable to achieve diplomatic success. A lot of that was discussed yesterday, so we'll have a chance to discuss that in today's discussion. And I feel like that intent by the Obama administration to change the facts on the ground has been there for a while, and it's the right intent. I think what we can all criticize and perhaps question is the commitment and the way they've gone about executing that. So implementation has been quite lacking, not to use any other words. And this is where significant progress needs to be made. We'll have a chance to discuss that as well. Now, I mentioned that if you commit to helping to end civil wars in Iraq and Syria, ISIS's power and influence will be dramatically reduced. So it will be a byproduct of that. Okay, well that begs the question: how do you end the civil wars? Right? It's not as easy as it sounds. Let me start by saying that even though ISIS is trying to force us to think about Iraq and Syria as one entity, and it's eliminated borders, the reality is that these are two quite distinct problem sets that we're dealing with. Obviously, Iraq poses a less significant challenge than Syria. Syria is way more profound, and it is, I guess, less fixable in the near term than Iraq is. So, having said that, that means that you have to have two distinct strategies for both countries. There's not a single strategy for both. We all know that the administration has adopted the Iraq first approach, and perhaps Syria last, and that in itself needs to change. A couple of words about Syria, a couple of words about Iraq, and then I'll shut up. Syria, you can forget about peace or any solution sets in that country if we continue to fail to build a credible, strong opposition force on the ground that would be capable of defeating or at least taking on effectively ISIS and regime forces. The discussion yesterday in many ways compared and contrasted the option of backing a proxy group that is currently operating in Syria. We're not going to name it, whoever it may be, but obviously the condition is that it would not have already killed Americans or committed to killing Americans. That would include Jabhat al-Nusra. The other option, which is far more effective but more difficult, as you can imagine, is actually creating an army. My good friend Ken Pollack wrote a good piece about that in Foreign Affairs. That army would be created outside the country. It would be credible enough and strong enough to take on both foes. We can discuss and compare and contrast both options. General Martin Dempsey just last month had quite a sensible plan and not outrageously ambitious about how you can actually create that kind of force. That plan went nowhere. We could all have our theories why it hasn't been implemented. Couple of words about Iraq, and then I'll stop. Obviously, the challenge is much different. We do have a functioning government. It's not perfect. In many ways, it has many flaws, but we do have a government, unlike in Syria. The main challenge there is, and Prime Minister Abadi has the right intent. He does want to reform the Iraqi security forces. He wants to bring back the Sunnis to government. And he's going to have to try to manage the, I would say, problematic relationship with Iran, and that's no easy task. He's a very, very busy man. Like I said, he has the right intentions, but I would just question two things, or I would just focus very much on two things. The bureaucracy, which is not going to help him. The Iraqi bureaucracy has been quite destroyed during the era of Saddam Hussein, and to rebuild it in a matter of a few years is going to be quite challenging. And then his own political strength. Okay, here this is someone who his Shiite rivals are looking over his shoulders, making sure that he would commit mistakes so they can replace him. That's not easy to operate in such an environment. And oh, by the way, he has to fight ISIS also. He has to create a credible enough army that would also include Sunni recruits. That's no easy thing to do. The unification of Sunni Iraqis has to be done by the Sunnis themselves. But there are certain steps that the Prime Minister himself should be doing, and this gets us back to the reforms, obviously supported by Ali Sistani, perhaps one of the most important Shiite religious figures today in the country. No easy task for the Prime Minister, but I think he is the right man for the job. That's my own opinion. We can debate that. And with that, let's go over the discussion.
Thank you, right here. Well, thanks very much, Bilal. And I want to turn to my very esteemed panelists in a second. Let me introduce them and first mention that there is, we are live on Twitter, so there is a hashtag which is AC Mideast, and we're tweeting from at AC Scowcraft. I'm at Barry Pavel, and I'm going to introduce the two panelists whom you haven't heard from yet. To my immediate left is Mr. Hassan Hassan. He is Associate Fellow at Chatham House, a non-resident Fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, and of course co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. He focuses on Syria, Iraq, and the Gulf states and studies Islamist, Salafist, and jihadist movements in the wider region. His writings have appeared pretty much everywhere. I won't go through the list. Next to him is Dr. Erin Simpson. She is Chief Executive Officer of Karas Associates. She previously directed all of Karas's classified research, but cannot tell you about it, and did it for the defense and intelligence communities here. Prior to joining Karas, she served as the strategic advisor to ISAF's counterinsurgency advisory and assistance team, where she regularly advised senior military commanders throughout Afghanistan on issues related to the campaign, strategic assessments, and illicit networks. So both panelists have a lot of experience here. I was going to ask them to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and I will use my new app, which administers electric shocks, light ones, if they go over. But we'll start us off with 5 to 7 minutes each, and then we'll engage in a conversation here, and then we'll open it up to you. And I think first I'll turn to Hassan for his initial thoughts.
First of all, thank you for having me here at the Atlantic Council. During this time, I want to highlight 3 trends that I think are very critical and important for the air campaign that is now going on against ISIS. The first one has to do with the question that we always hear, whether ISIS is a state, how it governs, and so on. And that's important because, like I said, it has implications for the kinetic effort. I think in terms of statehood, the statehood of ISIS is actually understated usually. I think ISIS statehood project is more intrusive and invasive and pronounced than even the ones by the Iraqi and the Syrian regimes that preceded them. And I'll explain how. I think one good example is how ISIS deals with the tribes, and we know that all the areas controlled by ISIS, almost 99% of the terrain that's controlled by ISIS is tribal. Dominated, even including in the areas that are very close to Damascus, which is counterintuitive. People think that Damascus is an urban area, which it is, but the area that's controlled by ISIS there, which is Hajar Aswad, the people who joined ISIS in there come from one tribe, or dominated, predominantly from one tribe. So I explain how both the Assad regime and the governments in Iraq, whether during Saddam Hussein or under the current system, dealt with tribes as intermediaries between them and the local population. ISIS comes in and it deals with tribes not as intermediary, but it deals with the organization itself, it deals with itself as an intermediary between tribes. It divides them, it plays them out against each other, but also resolves their disputes, goes out and, there are multiple examples of ISIS getting members of 2 tribes that had long standing disputes and resolve them because it thinks that will get people more closer to it as an actor, as a social intermediary or mediator. And I could go on about that, but there's no time. With regards to this issue, this particular issue, I predict that in, say, 5 years, there will be a rise of local members of ISIS that will influence and reshape the organization. Currently, it's dominated by foreign fighters, of course, by the leadership by Iraqis, but the foreign fighters play a big role in the military effort. But in 5 years, you will see a different dynamic. The second.
Can I just stop you real quick on that point, because I have to ask. So you think that ISIS's chances of survival and even continuing on as an effective network for 5 years at least is relatively assured?
Absolutely. I think I have no doubt that ISIS will stay at least for a decade, not only as a group that exists somewhere, but as a group that controls the terrain, most of the terrain that it currently controls, and even probably wider in the region. But so the second trend that I wanted to mention is what military officials call deputization. What ISIS does basically is to delegate. And this is a remarkable trend that people really should, focus on and try to get as much information about it as possible. Especially in Iraq and to a certain degree in Syria, it started to delegate some of the powers that it has, some of the responsibility to locals, especially local tribes that have established themselves as loyalists to the group. Without being at within the core membership of the organization, and this is a dangerous trend because ISIS has started to build links and deep-rooted association with the locals, and that's important. Also related to the first one about tribes and how it deals with tribes. The third one has more to do with directly with the impact of the current air campaign against ISIS. We've seen today, I think, or yesterday, a fascinating report by Financial Times saying that ISIS still earns $1.5 million a day from oil alone. So that calls into question about the impact of the air campaign that is targeting the financial roots of ISIS. Now, it's not only not effective, but also is counterproductive when it comes to the local population, because I've noticed a trend as well that more people are now joining ISIS because they have no other choice but to join the group. Everyone from communities living under ISIS would say that there is a general suspicion against ISIS. People suspect it, people don't trust it, people fear it, and they always deal with it as a temporary ruler, let's say, of their areas. But at the same time, desperate families, have started to allow their sons to join ISIS because of two things. The first one is that the airstrikes have disrupted a wartime economy that was functioning before ISIS came. And people, one of the family members would go and work in oil, for example. The oil, because it's cheap, people could operate their heavy vehicles or engines that pump water from the Euphrates River or the Tigris River to farmland, agricultural lands. Because of the airstrikes and because the airstrikes have disrupted this economy, people have no other choice. And I noticed that families do two things, or either of two things. The first one is either get their sons to join ISIS or send their sons overseas to Europe as refugees. So either join the refugee army or ISIS army. So, or both. Depends if they want to benefit from both things. So with that, I just want to warn against a lot of hyper kind of headlines about ISIS and how ISIS is actually being defeated. I think ISIS is still expanding in some areas, but the majority of its effort is focused on the other segment of its slogan, which is to remain and to expand, which is to remain. And I think it's focused on entrenchment of its rule in its areas. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very important. So in some ways, the headlines, and especially in Washington, are about the military operations and the dramatic sort of hard power dimensions to this. But what you're telling us is that while we've been focused on these headlines, ISIS has been consolidating its main sources of power and sustainability through governance and through softer power, for want of a better word, approaches to sustaining its network.
Absolutely. We've seen examples of people saying that a lot of members are disillusioned with ISIS because they came and they didn't find the right or the life that they were promised. The fact of the matter is, ISIS provides, and the most important product of ISIS is security. And I heard it from many people who don't like ISIS, from my area, from other areas, is that, regardless of how ISIS is, if you avoid getting in trouble with ISIS, then ISIS provides something that we want, which is security. People no longer get kidnapped or killed randomly. You could go on with your life. There's safety, there's security, and that's very essential. That's very important.
But ISIS security is like mob security, right? The people who are going to kidnap and kill you are ISIS. So yeah, if you sign up for their particular insurance plan, right?
It's a regulated kind of regulated violence. You could have some psychological control over whether you wake up in the morning and you go to the market, you're not going to be killed unless you like you do something wrong. Before that, you need to have a gun, and if you get into a minor fight with someone, you might be killed.
Okay. Well, we're definitely going to want to come back to this underappreciated element of the phenomenon of ISIS. I want to turn to Dr. Simpson now, who's started her remarks. We'd like you to offer some of your broad thoughts on these questions.
We can come back to this question because I think it's an interesting one, which is a distinction between tolerance and popularity. Providing security is an interesting way of establishing control and establishing this psychological certainty, which I agree is very important and is really different from popularity or legitimacy. One of the things I think over the last month or so, as the sort of Russian campaign has emerged in Syria, is that it's brought this discussion of ISIS back to Syria from what has, for most of the last year and a half, been an Iraq discussion on the U.S. side in particular. And not only does it bring it back to Syria, it brings it back to the Syrian civil war, and in particular this question of Assad. So in many ways, the U.S. strategy, as Dan Chu mentioned yesterday, has been a counterterrorism strategy characterized by counterterror strikes against ISIS as an organization, whether the financial, the oil fields or against key leadership. It's also been an Iraq-first strategy, right? We're going to build a partnership capacity, build up the Iraqi army, recapture Mosul, which the clock is still ticking on, and sort of build up that side, and we would see sort of what would happen in Syria. For a variety of reasons, all of which have to do with more or less facts on the ground, I think that we're forced to relook the Syria piece. We felt like we had a lot of good options in terms of Syria policy, so we sort of punted on creating very many good ones. I don't think we have that luxury any longer, neither diplomatically nor militarily. That's actually, I think, from an analytic perspective, very important, because the Syrian civil war, in many ways, was always the sucking chest wound that was going to long-term continue to cause these problems. And so a counter-terror campaign against ISIS that didn't resolve or remediate any elements of the Syrian civil war wasn't going to get you very far in the long term. The Syrian civil war is, as it has been from the beginning, about Assad and about the legitimacy of the Assad regime, and how the Syrian rebels of various stripes want to deal with that. I think one of the things that's an interesting part of that discussion, once you start talking about the Syrian civil war, you start talking about conflict dynamics on the ground, you start talking about political processes and political resolution. You also have to start talking about Jabhat al-Nusra, right, which is an incredibly effective military fighting force, also an incredibly effective governing force, particularly in Idlib, but also elsewhere. And they're not ISIS isn't the only one who's providing security to gain legitimacy at the hands of an otherwise incredibly unpopular ideology. And that is a really difficult political space to look at in terms of civil war settlement or a broad-scale political process. I do think, though, that shift back to what do we want to do about Assad, what do the Syrians want done with Assad, what are the reputable players who should be at a table having that discussion amongst Syrians themselves, is the place where the conversation should have been for the last long while and has returned to once again. And so hopefully we can have part of that discussion here again today.
Great, well, thank you. Bilal, did you have any additional thoughts before I start?
No, it's a broad point. I think that the adjustments and the changes that I mentioned that need to be done to wage a more effective campaign against ISIS require some acceptance by this White House of political risk and commitment to providing a number of resources. And I'm not sure that the administration is willing to do any of that.
Yeah. One of the things that I take away a lot from war games, or strategic path games as they're now euphemistically called, but this was at the strategic level, is sort of a greater degree of insight into how an adversary that's often characterized in caricatures in the media might act and think strategically. And I'll just give you a couple of, it was a non-attribution war game, but a couple of insights or thoughts from the group playing the red team in this case really struck me. I mean, one of the key planks of their approach to succeeding going forward was, we like Russia in Syria. We're going to target Russia. And they're not just targeting Russia for sensationalistic reasons, but they think that by doing so, they can increase recruiting from Russia and its surrounding countries. So they're really looking at the Russian deployment as a strategic opportunity. And you know the types of things they will do using social media and other means to capitalize on that opportunity. Another thing that came out from of the discussion yesterday was they want to drive a wedge between the United States and Turkey. They want to keep those countries on separate paths. They would love to conduct attacks in Turkey and leave a Kurdish calling card, for reasons that are obvious to many of you. But I think this really gives us some insights. I mean, from the vantage point of Washington, we often look at these and think about these conflicts and questions from a U.S.-centric point of view, and it's sort of what can we do to or with our allies and partners in the region. But I think, as the Pentagon likes to say, the enemy gets a vote, and we need to be thinking in a time-phased interactive fashion about next steps by a very adaptive and agile adversary. And so those were two insights, but I'd love to turn to my panelists to offer any other thoughts on where do they think ISIS is going to go moving forward, not just consolidating its gains in terms of governance and economy, but what else might ISIS do in light of the current situation today and how things might play out?
Well, ISIS has been doing stuff despite the airstrikes. We've seen them taking over two very important cities, Palmyra, and Palmyra because they could move from Palmyra into Homs, but more importantly into the southern Syria, where they could actually establish a presence that they couldn't establish because of the rebel forces more than the government, because the rebel forces controlled that terrain for a while, and they resisted the existence of ISIS in their territories because it's an existential threat for them. And the second city, which is I think its most important gain since Mosul, which is Ramadi, for many reasons. The most important one of them is the fact that Ramadi represented the anti-ISIS Sunni resistance for many years, since 2006. And the fact that they could actually topple the forces there, the Sunni forces there, and take control of that city is huge. Is basically killing that potential for anti-ISIS Sunni resistance. The remaining city that represents a similar dynamic to, as Ramadi is Haditha, which is ISIS trying to get, but there's still resistance. And that resistance has been going on since ISIS took Mosul last year. So these are very important gains, despite the airstrikes, despite the fact that there's an Iraq-first strategy. They took Ramadi. So that tells us how ISIS is expanding still. Although, like I said, I think the majority of its effort is focused on constant, on like entrenchment of its existence in its areas. The second probably aspect of what ISIS will go from here, or where it will go from here, is I think it will focus on reigniting, like we said yesterday in the sessions, the civil war in Syria. I think they will try to do this because Syria has proven to be a very important asset for ISIS in terms, like as an environment, but also as a gateway from Turkey into Iraq and Syria for foreign fighters and so on. So the fact or the idea that the civil war would end will cause ISIS to kind of worry. So they will focus on reigniting and getting the Russians to be more involved in Syria. The intuitive thing to say is like, don't provoke the bear, the Russian bear. Don't provoke the Russians because you know what the Russians will do to you. The fact of the matter is ISIS will not hesitate to provoke the Russians, to get them more involved, to get them, like we raised a question yesterday, whether if ISIS captures a Russian pilot, would it burn the Russian pilot just like it did with the Jordanian pilot? And some people hesitate to say maybe not, because they wouldn't want to provoke the Russians. But I have no doubt that ISIS would do it because it represents, even if it costs them Raqqa, even if it costs them maybe another city, it will get them to gain a lot internationally because that would be a symbolic thing for all people who share that mindset, jihadi mindset. People will flock into ISIS areas because ISIS actually achieved something that they all want.
Thank you.
Bilal?
Yeah, survival obviously will be the key priority for this organization, and they'll take as much as they can, but I have to disagree with Hassan's assessment that we're going to have this organization with us for the next decade. I think that there are some serious limitations to the limitations to the expansion that they can actually achieve because of demographics and sectarian dynamics in the region. As if the ISIS story is not depressing enough, let me inject a little bit more pessimism to it by saying the following. In an ideal scenario where they are actually defeated, and by that I mean they do not control a significant amount of territory and they do not have a semblance of a state. Even in that ideal scenario, if they go underground, something I wrote about 2 or 3 years ago, I'm not sure that that's the best piece of news for counter-terrorism agencies because there's a lot of them. It's that simple. There's a lot of people in that organization that will go underground.
A lot of people underground. That's the definition of being underground, right?
Well, I mean, if I can't see them, I'm much more worried about them than they are if they are above ground.
There's 50,000 of them. You'll see them.
If they do transform into a terrorist model, something like Al-Qaeda, I'm definitely going to be worried about that. There's a huge foreign fighter component in it. And so what we had in Al-Qaeda, you might want to double, triple that if ISIS were to transform actually into a purely terrorist model if they go underground. So even in the ideal scenario where they are defeated, but we can no longer see them and they want to turn into this transnational jihadist actor, I'm not sure that's good news either, for Western societies at least.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Are you pessimistic about their prospects? Do you think they'll survive for a while in light of the strengths you're highlighting, or do you think they're not going to be around?
It depends who you ask. For people in the region, this is obviously, for a number of countries, an existential threat, right? And I would even include Saudi Arabia for it. But for Western societies, obviously the key priority has always been to limit, if not completely eliminate, the terrorist potential to the homeland, to other European capitals. So it depends who you really ask. And I'm not sure which one would you prioritize sitting here in Washington. I would bet that is the transnational terrorist threat and not the threat that they pose to regional partners.
I think that one thing that's interesting about this sort of discussion that Hassan brings up about the consolidation versus expansion instincts or prerogatives of ISIS. Two of my analysts, Yasser Abbas and Dan Trombley, and their old boss, Germana Kador, is here with us here today as well, wrote a great piece of analysis sort of looking at the political economy of ISIS. I take issue with this Financial Times report about 1.5 million from oil a day. Oil from Western Syria trades for $10 a barrel. I don't know how they're getting 1.5 million a day out of that. The ISIS economy in many ways requires sort of captured spoils from new territories. I mean, it's a raiding economy in a lot of instances. Certainly it was, through early parts of this year. They're settling down, they're trying to work out the governance and taxation piece of it.
They're still making a lot of money, right? I think the American raid in Deir ez-Zor recently discovered that the initial expectations that ISIS financial routes were disrupted were overstated. That the fact that the ISIS was still making more than the official estimates made up.
But I think they're making a good deal of that money through expansion, not just through oil in the existing, Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor.
I think in terms of expansion, they stopped making financial gains from two important sources. The first one is weapons seized from their enemies, from the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, or the rebel forces, because the American-led airstrikes have contained them militarily. They've been successful in that sense. So they're no longer in Diyala, in Kurdish areas, or in rebel-held areas. And the second one is basically that the confiscation from new territories and making gains from new lands and stuff like that. But they are still making a lot of money from the local population, taxes, oil, maybe less oil, but more.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Both of you mentioned Russia. I mean, obviously we cannot game Syria anymore without taking into account what Russian motives and what Russian designs are in the country. So if there's one thing that they have accomplished, we can no longer think about the future of the country without Russia. Not that we could before, but now it's pretty clear, given the military commitment and the fact that they have sent a very clear message to Washington that you have to talk to us regarding the future of the country. So I think a key question here, there's been a lot of commentary recently about it, is the main man in Damascus expendable for the Russians and the Iranians? Under the right set of circumstances, is this someone that they can give up on to move the process forward and to try to solve this crisis? I don't have the answer to that. I think that a lot of people are trying to see the gap or the tension between the Russians and the Iranians on how they feel about Assad himself. Okay, so I have my theory on how the Russians would view the importance of Assad and how the Iranians would. I think that the Iranians, in a heartbeat, would give up on the man. I've not that I have talked to a huge sample of Iranians, but a few. I just returned from Lebanon where I had a nice chat with a high-ranked Hezbollah official. This is someone they can give up on very easily. Okay, but again, under the right set of circumstances. It might be the same with Russia. A lot of people in this room, I'm sure, know much more about Russia than I do. But the main prism the Russians have been looking at Syria is quite interesting in terms of how they view stability in the region, but overall in the world. Stability for them, and what happens in Syria for them has repercussions not just in the region, but also in their own country. They view stability through the prism of a strong man. And I think that until there's a clear alternative of another strong man in Syria, they will hang on very dearly to Assad. I think the Iranians might have different machinations and different designs on how to bring about someone from the Alawite community to replace him. As I mentioned yesterday, not too long ago, 2-3 years ago probably, there was a consideration of a man who was the son of the former defense minister, Manaf Tlass. That went nowhere, obviously. But I think that the key difference between the Russian mindset and the Iranian mindset on what stability constitutes in Syria is quite interesting. It is almost summarized in the Russian mindset in one strong man, because if that changes, it could have repercussions not just in the region, but also probably in Russia, in the long term. So they do not want to create a precedent where a dictator is easily removed and then someone else comes in. Interesting. The American mindset is very different. I mean, I think we've learned quite a lot from the Arab uprising. We did have that mindset before, but with the Arab uprising and the theory that a strong man could achieve stability is now completely bogus. I think that the United States is slowly but surely adopting a much more progressive understanding of stability, which you have written about, Barry, which is much more dynamic. Now, whether we get there, that's a different question.
Hassan, Aaron, any
Yeah.
comments on the Russia factor?
I think, in theory, both the Iranians and the Russians think that Assad is expendable. But practically speaking, if you're, on the ground and like the regime kind of dynamics, interdynamics, I think it's very hard to imagine that Assad would go and the regime will stay together. There is a lot of tension. There's a lot of, Assad is not just a president. He's a symbol of the old order.
Right.
If he goes, how to keep these people together.
Right.
And I think, even if Russia would tell you we're willing to give up on Assad under the right set of circumstances, or the Iranians say that, I think practically speaking, it's hard to imagine that.
I think the Russians have a pretty complex set of interests and are playing their own domestic and European game in a setting that happens to be Syria. So we've done a pretty bad job anticipating what their actions and motivations have been over the last 3 weeks. I would hesitate to speculate, further on that front. Other than to say, I don't think that they went into Syria from a position of strength. I don't think they went into Syria because Assad was doing great. They also didn't go in 2012. If it's, the strong man is so important, they were willing to leave him out on a string for quite some time, twisting in the wind. So, there's a lot of dynamics. I do think it's important to note, as Bilal does, this asymmetry of interest, or this gap of interest between the Russians and the Iranians. They happen to back the same individual, but with some different underlying motivations, I think.
I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but then turn to the audience to open this discussion up. And the questions are about, so we've talked quite a bit about the dynamics of what's going on in Syria and the wider region and ISIS's potential paths going forward. What can we do about it? What can the international community, how can we resolve this? This is one of those cases where I think as time has gone on, things have gotten worse for every party that's potentially affected. So July of 2011, things were bad, and there were lots of policy choices about, in particular in the United States, about not getting more involved. And those choices were based on calculations about things not getting worse, but they have clearly gotten worse in every possible way. So how do you think about resolving this conflict in a way that we're not, that all parties aren't worse off in 2016 and 2020?
I think the best way is a gradual way, or a gradualist, let's say, way, because I think everyone wants to achieve everything at once or not do anything at all. And I think this is the folly of the current policy internationally. I think people should stop talking about the Damascus, resolution, a resolution that actually, resolve the conflict in Damascus, whether the opposition will be in government or not. I think that's beyond us, and that's not to, you don't neglect that, you keep it in the mind and you try to push for it. But I think you need to kind of focus on the dynamics on the ground. I think you need to, and I will give an example why that's effective. You need to focus on creating a balance on the ground that forces the regime to not accept the removal of Bashar al-Assad, but to accept some sort of a reality, like facts on the ground. Recently, we saw a very interesting truce between the rebels, including jihadists, Al-Qaeda included, for example, and the Syrian regime in around 13 towns around Syria, in the south and in the north, including Zabadani near the Lebanese border and Fua near the Turkish border. Now, the truce was mediated by Iran. And part of the truce was for the Assad regime to stop flying helicopters and warplanes above these towns, which is a remarkable concession for the regime to make. Why did the regime accept that? Why did the Iranians accept that? It's because the force that controlled these areas, which is Jaish al-Fatah, or the Army of Conquest, had been effective. It led a series of gains against the Assad regime. It got the rebels to reach the heartlands of the Assad regime in Hama, and in Aleppo and Latakia. And that's I think a model that everyone should be thinking about, which is basically how to get the rebels strong enough so they can change, they create peace locally, provisionally, rather than think about what happens in Damascus. And the fact that the Iranians accepted that and the truce in theory still holds, no one announced that it ends, you know, that's a remarkable thing to think about.
So those are truces that are sort of holding measures, but do you have any thoughts sort of on the broader resolution of how do we get to an outcome where the war is resolved?
The war,
even if it takes a while.
Like I said, gradual, as in probably I didn't continue the point, is basically to kind of de-escalate the conflict somehow by getting these truces to work out, but also to get the Russians and the Iranians somehow to also de-escalate. You need to get a force, a Sunni rebel force, not in a sectarian sense, but in like a demographic sense, a Sunni force that is acceptable by the local population to become so strong and formidable that it fights both the Assad regime and ISIS. And I think the best location for that is a group in Aleppo and Idlib in the north.
Jaish al-Fatah, Jabhat al-Nusra, right?
A similar one, but it doesn't have to be these two groups. Ahrar Sham, I suspect that they are genuinely moving towards moderation. I think they're just doing tactical moves advised by their backers, regional backers. I don't think there's a genuine move towards moderation, but there is slightly, not in the sense that they presented, but like but there's still time to do something with the Free Syrian Army, and I think also a perfect example is recently when the Russian intervention started in Syria. The Free Syrian Army destroyed around 20 tanks, and everyone in Syria, including Islamists, were saying good for the FSA. This is great. This is our hope, and so on. So there's chance to revive that model, but no one is helping them. So the Atlantic Council did a recent report. Faisal, I think, did it, which is that you need to focus on competition and how to get the Free Syrian Army to compete with the jihadists, not to destroy them, to fight them, because fighting them will be counterproductive. You need to get them to compete without, these brands.
Okay, so we have a year and a half remaining in this administration. I think the most likely course of action we're going to see is stay the course. Okay, I don't think that it's going to be a little bit less than that. We're not going to see any major changes in the current approach. The right thing to do, once again, less likely, is to achieve a set of first downs to get the next president at the red zone, right? And I think that would be the right thing to do, but is the less is the more politically risky approach. That means everything that Hassan was just mentioning, really getting serious, getting on the right track as far as building a credible, conventional, and strong Syrian opposition force, helping as much as you can diplomatically Prime Minister Abadi with the efforts that he has laid out already. There's a lot of matchy-matchy between what the President is saying on Iraq and what the Prime Minister is saying. All you have to do is just a commitment to actually implementing what they're talking about.
This sounds like, but this time with feeling, right? Like, that's in this sort of, but we'll do more. I don't know that that's...
I said the next year is we're going to see very few changes, frankly. That's the most realistic...
That's a different answer from asking what could be done or should be done, right? I mean, I don't
That's
think...
for the next administration. That's my opinion.
We also have to recognize the constraints on the ground.
Stick with your football analogy. It's quite a punt, That's...
in both Iraq and Syria, I think the momentum is behind us in a lot of ways against ISIS. In Iraq, for example, I think the Shia forces and the Kurdish forces, which were very effective and very important in containing ISIS in Iraq, have reached a point where they no longer fight in their areas, so they're less interested in fighting ISIS, and they're exhausted, they're tired, but also not interested. The idea that they will fight in Fallujah or Ramadi, on Haditha, or in Mosul is far-fetched. You can't imagine that. And I think that trend again started after Tikrit, when during the Battle of Tikrit, if you remember, 30,000, 35,000 even forces moved into Tikrit to take Tikrit, and thousands of them were killed. And finally, ISIS only lost 1,000 fighters, and now Tikrit is mostly destroyed. Lots of people went back, yes, to their areas, but it's not a model that neither the Sunnis think. Like people in Mosul, they would say, I wouldn't support such a thing because I would rather keep my home intact rather than get it destroyed by some airstrikes. And for the Shia also say, why do you have to go and fight in Sunni areas? So I think that the momentum in a lot of ways, and I mentioned only that way, is behind us. And that's why I say ISIS will stay with us for a long time.
And I think that one piece to look at here, from a very craven, narrow U.S. national interest, great game, Geopolitical perspective, is to watch the Russians get bogged down and, see what happens as they work through their own third-party counterinsurgency campaign, right? They're backing a weak state actor, not coming in from a position of strength. They've got, 3 or 4 different coalitions of opposing forces to deal with, and they're, stuck in Latakia, right? They have very little territory to control themselves. That would be potentially an appealing policy, if not for the utter human carnage that will absolutely result in, right? And so, I think, Jeremy Shapiro from Brookings talked about this, last week. We have avoided, for the most part, treating the symptoms, preferring instead some sort of holistic treatment of the underlying cause, but doing very little while we wait for it all to work all at once. There might be some palliative care in terms of a much more robust humanitarian, in particular refugee response that needs to get addressed, that would at least alleviate some of those pressures, not just on our NATO allies, but also more importantly, our regional allies, Turkey and Jordan, but provide some space to let this other great game piece play out a bit longer.
I think that's a disastrous approach. I don't want to test the proposition that the Russians might actually succeed, A, and B, that solidifies the perception that we don't have any resolve in the Middle East, and the regional partners are closely watching
what should we do, Bilal?
I don't think we should be watching what the Russians are doing and hoping that they might.
I heard that part, but so what should we do?
I think in Syria we need big ticket items that this administration is not willing to do. I'm talking about diplomacy, what we discussed yesterday as far as the president holding a major summit with the key players with vested interests in the region. That's the Turks, the Saudis, the Jordanians.
For to do what?
Lebanon.
For to resolve the civil war?
To get the process started as far as the political process, what needs to be done?
We spent a long time yesterday talking about how that process is the Geneva process and was signed
That's the
3 years
framework.
ago.
That's
right?
the framework, but actually they need to sit down and start talking.
Now let's open it up to the audience and look for additional discussants. Way in the back there, I think, take as the first question.
Thank you so much. Pam Dawkins with Voice of America, and I have 2 questions. First of all, for Hassan, in your opening statements, you indicated that you believe the air campaign is ineffective. Can you talk a little about what you believe would be the alternative? Would it be ground forces, an expansion of ground forces? And then secondly, what, in your view, would be the impact of a significant influx of Iranian troops in Syria? And then for Bilal, you've indicated that the administration's current position, especially regarding Syria, is sort of timid. Why do you believe that the current administration is not willing to wade deeper into the conflict, in particular in Syria?
So first question on military operational effectiveness. Any takers?
Yeah.
That's where Hassan was.
Don't get me wrong. I think the airstrikes were inevitable, and they have to be there. Otherwise, ISIS would have gone to Erbil and maybe to Baghdad and further. So the airstrikes have been effective in containing ISIS territory, like militarily. So it has to think twice before going somewhere. I think the alternative should be a combination of airstrikes and ground forces, but not Nobody is asking for American ground forces or troops on, boots on the ground. And I think President Obama said that before. He said, we have found that the best way forward is to have ground forces on the ground, like strikers on the ground, and supported by basically by the air campaign. And that has been effective in multiple areas. In Kobani, although the battle in Kobani took 4 months, but it finally drove ISIS out of Kobani. And it has been effective in Tel Abyad, near Kobani. And it has been, of course, in Iraq, like I said, in mixed sectarian areas like Diyala and Sinjar and so on. So I think, I think that's the best way militarily.
Great. And then Bilal, I think you can keep this answer short because I think we've discussed this quite a bit in this room. And
I think it starts with the commander-in-chief. I think he's excessively cautious on Syria, and he's setting the tone as far as the Syria policy. And the preferences that he has are quite dominant, frankly. There's also a political risk for greater involvement, so he's very aware of that. The way his cabinet is perceiving the challenges is not the same way we are. They see him as far more significant, and there's a sense, at least talking to some of the folks who do have responsibilities for Syria, that this is a country that's, at least in its current shape, unfixable. So that's what I understand from it.
great. We have 2 questions in the second row here. We'll take first the gentleman.
Regarding what Mr.
If you could
Hassan
identify
said,
yourself. I know who you are, but not everybody does.
Khairallah. Regarding what Mr. Hassan said about the ceasefire in Syria, I believe that this ceasefire was not mediated by Iran. It was imposed by Iran for very specific reasons. Iranians are interested in a sectarian exchange in Syria between Shias and Sunnis. I think this shows that Iran has its own project in Syria. Here, it's very important to see that this project differs a little bit from what the Soviets, the Russians, really want in Syria. This is only a point that I wanted to clarify.
Great. So I think for those who couldn't hear, the point was that the ceasefire was imposed by Iran, the ceasefire that Hassan discussed. And so, Hassan, I don't know if you have any response to that.
The ceasefire was mediated by both Turkey and Iran, and both of them were involved. And at some point they involved the UN as well. The UN was kind of was supposed to oversee the implementation of the plan. Now you're right. I think one of the worrying aspects of the truce was the demographic transfer, because there was a plan to get Sunnis out of Zabadani near the Lebanese border and get some of the Shia out of Fura in northern Syria. And the UN branch or mission in Syria objected to that, still has reservations about that part. But I think it's not a substantial transfer. It was just like older men and women, and not fighters, for example, not like military aged people. And it's limited in numbers. That's why the Jaysh al-Fatah agreed to it. Jaysh al-Fatah, I spoke to some of them, and they said they were excited about the outcome. They thought it's actually favorable to them. And that's why I thought it's a remarkable kind of development.
Interesting.
Great. I understand your point of view, but I'm talking about the whole idea about this sectarian dimension.
I think
This is what I want to.
That's one of the worrying things about Iranian involvement in Syria. Probably in opposition to the Russian approach. Not that they have tensions or differences, but I think the Iranians would not mind a regime that it's not a state. It's a militia, like it's a sort of like a militia that, as long as they have a path from Iran to Iraq to Syria and to Lebanon, they're good. And if the civil war continues, I think that's also good. They don't want a process where the Saudis and everyone start to have influence and so on. They're willing to, kind of give up some territory, move the demographics around so they can have like more solid roots. So that's the worrying thing about Iran. I don't think Iran has good intentions in that sense.
Barbara Slavin.
Yeah, thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Bilal, you revealed a little bit of what we talked about yesterday in the game. I wonder if you could talk about some of the other conclusions that we came to, even if you think it's unrealistic that the Obama administration would go for it. For example, the notion of a safe zone. Does the Russian entrance into the war, as some analysts have written, mean that it's not possible to have that kind of zone on the border between Syria and Turkey? Does the fact that the Turkish government is so upset about U.S. support for the PYD mean that that's no longer a real project? And also, if you could just tell me what happens to this study. Do you brief the government? What do you do with this? Thanks.
I'll answer the second part. Maybe I'll defer to Erin because she was leading one of the blue teams. I'm going to be writing the analysis, and it should be up sometime next week. But yes, we will have a chance to brief whoever wants to hear, basically, from the government. And I think that there was interest in the game because we had some folks from the government participating yesterday, including former officials. And so as soon as I have a copy of it, I'm sure I will share it with you, but it should be up on the website. Did you want to elaborate on safe zones?
Sure. Well, Barbara was in my group, so she knows our discussion on safe zones, which we had, I think, a fairly lengthy conversation. One is sort of a question more generally of a no-fly zone and if or how that might be enforced. I'm very much of the opinion that the Russian participation complicates that immensely. Question of safe zone versus enclave. Whichever language you want to use, one being more of strictly humanitarian interest, another that might be more political military consolidation of opposition forces. All of that would probably be, there's an interesting idea potentially to do something in the south, but the Jordanians have basically opposed that for many years now. Some sort of buffer zone or safe zone in what are now essentially Kurdish-dominated areas, PYD, YPG areas along the northern border, and possibly some rump area of northern Aleppo. And I think that's, remains, from what I understand from the conversations yesterday and elsewhere, sort of an active topic of discussion at what I might call worker bee levels within the government. The administration at the highest levels does not seem to be particularly energized, but that doesn't mean it's not being continually evaluated and addressed. I think this Turkish question is, sort of one of the real keys, and our policies vis-a-vis the Syrian and Iraqi Kurds and sort of the broader Turkish agenda and interests are quite complicated. So I'm fairly ambivalent myself on the question of sort of safe zones. There's a great humanitarian impulse there, but I actually don't know that it A, protects people all that well, and B, it's sort of another concession from, there's a lot of political will that has to get brought there, and I don't know who all has an interest in allowing that to happen.
Interesting. And I'll step out of moderator role too and say one of the key takeaways that at least I personally took from the game was if the U.S. and its partners and allies want to play a role, then they need more leverage. If they want to move the diplomatic process, to any tangible degree forward in a way that moves toward a sustainable solution, leverage is required, and that leverage means a more significant military investment. There's just no way around it. You need to change the conditions on the ground in order to provide the right incentives for Assad and his allies to come to the table in a meaningful way. And what that looks like, you can talk about different approaches at the operational and tactical levels, but it's really a bottom line sort of minimum requirement for having any meaningful process go forward. The Russian role, in particular, will only respond to that additional leverage. Absent that, then there doesn't strike me as there being very many substantial incentives for any of the current parties to change their positions or their activities.
Maybe just a quick word about the no-fly zone. I think if a serious diplomatic process would kickstart, the concept of a no-fly zone would be almost redundant because it would be with the consultation, cooperation, coordination, whatever word you want to use, with the Russians. Nobody's talking about a no-fly zone in the current circumstances where you can risk a dogfight with the Russian Air Force. So
I disagree, but let's move on. I have two questions, one from the gentleman in the second row and then one in the first row, and then I'll broaden as we move towards the end of the session.
Thank you. Hamid Yunus from Gallup. I just wanted to ask the panel, but particularly I think Hassan, somebody who's not based in Washington, what do you say to the statement that I hear a lot in this city now, which is this is a 1,000-year-old sectarian war, and there really is no U.S. Western policy that will end this war? Not a view I personally hold, but definitely something that a lot of us are hearing by some here in Washington. I see Bilal nodding his head.
I think groups like ISIS have a narrow audience, and this is we have to keep in mind. This is something that we have to keep in mind. It has a narrow audience, but it's a narrow customer base, as in like if they join this brand or they buy this brand, then it's profitable in the long term. That's why it's not a really sectarian fight. It's easy, like even people who buy into the sectarian narrative, it's easy to reverse that when something happens and they say, oh, we're Syrians or we're Iraqis. And we've seen evidence of that. It's not just speculation. Like the recent protests in Baghdad and southern Iraq, they were anti-sectarian. No one asked them that. The Sunnis were not involved in the protest. It was a Shia-based kind of protest movement, and they spoke out against sectarianism because they thought Iran is exploiting the situation in Iraq, and there were some slogans. There were anti-Iran slogans, and which is I think amazing that we heard that, and pro like nationalist voices. So I think the sectarian the sectarian dynamic is something that groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra tap into. It's useful, and it will continue to be there. And I think it's growing. We've seen, when Putin, for example, when the Russians intervened in Syria, there were a lot of pro-Putin slogans in Iraq because they thought the Americans were not serious about the fight against ISIS. The Russians will be. And when the Saudis, for example, intervened in Yemen, there were a lot of positive sentiments towards the Saudis and anti-ISIS sentiments in the region, because people thought like this is finally a country, a Sunni country, doing something against Shia or Shia allies in the region.
The argument. So there's a great deal of historical and contemporary evidence to cross-cut that, not the least of which is, a dozen different subnational alliances going on across the region, and that the primary target of ISIS, for the most part, has been fellow Sunnis, right? They have not killed a great deal of Shia to my count. So,
But it's an essential part of, even if ISIS is killing Sunnis, it's killing them as a tactical thing, because these Sunnis oppose the Sunni project of ISIS.
I don't disagree that ISIS has a fundamentally sectarian, millenarian agenda. That's distinct from saying that our policies are incapable of addressing such a thing.
A question from the front row.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz. To pick up on your comment, Mr. Hassan, about the fatigue, shall we say, of the Iraqi army to fight in the Shia popular mobilization forces. Last year, the Iraqi Kurds, the Peshmerga, were considered the ones that could take the fight. They were sort of the ones that could fight ISIS, and indeed they held them and they took over Kirkuk. So I wonder, I haven't really heard any discussion here about the Iraqi Kurds, and I wonder if you could comment on the current crisis there. President Barzani's term expired August 19th. We're 2 months in and there's no resolution. The Kurdish parliament president was stopped from going to the capital. I mean, there's obviously, a serious political crisis, and I'm wondering how you think this might affect, the Peshmerga role against ISIS.
Thank you. Based on my conversations with senior American, officials involved in the fight against ISIS, I think they think that the Kurds are indispensable in the fight against ISIS. They've proven to be really effective, really motivated to fight ISIS. They're unlike other groups. They think that they've suffered so many massacres and atrocities over the years that they cannot just give up. So also they have a project of like expansion project in Syria, as well as in Iraq, a little like on a much lesser degree. But then we have, again, to recognize the constraints. I think within Kurdistan, the Iraqi Kurdistan, there are a lot of political kind of battles that President Barzani and the Peshmerga have to deal with. Peshmerga in the sense that the Yazidis at some point felt that there was not a serious push to actually protect them until the Americans came. So there's that kind of tension. It's not major, but it's just an example of the kind of fault lines within Kurdistan, and of course, also when it comes to the Turkey and the Turkish position on the involvement of Kurds against ISIS. There have been like a tug of war between the United States and Turkey over the nature of the role played by the Kurds. So I think we have to consider all these things. So it's not just the Kurds are motivated to fight ISIS; they are, but what about the other problems, internal and external? Because in Syria, for example, the Kurds cannot go to Raqqa without the involvement and the leadership of Sunni forces. But some people try to get them to fight in Raqqa because they're willing to fight in Raqqa. People underestimate the deep tensions between the tribes and Sunnis and Arabs, like in northern Syria, and the Kurds. And that is something to keep in mind.
For an indispensable partner, the U.S. support has been pretty stingy, but I understand the Turkish concern.
We have 5 minutes left. We're going to start taking very short questions and collecting them. So those who have real succinct questions, please ask. One from the second row, one from the third. We'll take them both, and then I'll continue.
Hi, I'm Nisaba. I'm a senior resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council. You talked, Hassan, about governance. How would you compare ISIS's governance to Jabhat al-Nusra and to AQI back in the day? And how has it been impacted both by airstrikes and by the Iraqi government's stopping of salaries, which seems to have really undermined economic activity, particularly in Mosul? And on the tribal front, how has ISIS been so successful in executing pretty draconian punishments against tribally affiliated people in its territory, particularly against things like corruption, whilst also avoiding revenge?
Great, thank you. And then the question from the third row.
Hi, Gary Sargent. I'm a retired Army officer. Spent some time in Lebanon, and I don't hear a lot about Lebanon and increased U.S. military aid and some other things. If somebody could just add a piece on how ISIS is impacting Lebanon, what do you see with the future?
Thanks very much. So the first two questions on governance and how the tribes are handling this.
Okay. So in comparison to Nusra, simply put, Nusra focuses on winning hearts and minds. ISIS is always critical of this approach. They think that this is an idealization or like a kind of fetish in the kind of communal, or winning hearts and minds. It has been very critical. Actually, Abu Muhammad al-Adnani just gave a statement, and he focused on that. He said, Jabhat al-Nusra approach is not effective, and we will go after everyone regardless of whether they're going to be happy or not. In terms of salaries, and this is, I think, one of the mistakes, and bluntly to say that, I will say that bluntly, one of the mistakes of the American government is to ask the Iraqi government to stop paying salaries because, people depend, families, whole families, tens, probably thousands of families, depending on these salaries to sustain themselves. Where do they go if the salaries stopped? There was no plan. You target these communities. It seems like sanctions never work in the Middle East. They never worked with Iran, or maybe they worked. I don't know. Depends on how you see it. It didn't work with Saddam Hussein, and it will never won't work with ISIS. In terms of tribes, ISIS is used, like I said, two things: the intimidation of tribes, and people will think 1,000 times before they rebel against ISIS because they've seen the fate of the Shi'itat in Deir ez-Zor or Al-Bunimir in Iraq, and they don't want ISIS to go after them because they know that ISIS stay. I mean, this is a good metric, I think, always when you see tribes aligning with someone. That means that faction is staying longer than other forces because they know that the Americans are not going to come to help them, and even if they come, they will leave soon. No one is going to come and stay there. So that's why they bet and gamble on ISIS.
On the governance question, I think that there's also Nusra's done a couple of interesting things. I would say one is to focus a lot on dispute resolution and judicial or other kind of policing type services, and that's very deliberate on their part. It's less resource intensive, but also insinuates you into very clear day-to-day parts of people's lives. They've also done a lot to work next to local councils or provincial councils without jamming their hands firmly into it now, and that's a very clever way of making sure that folks in Idlib keep getting money from Western governments. But it's also part of a broader, whether you want to call it hearts and minds, a phrase I wish I could burn for all eternity, or a very clever campaign. You know, it's a useless phrase. They're not doing it because they want people to like them. They're doing it because they think it's an effective way of maintaining political control, and it is. I think is the short answer. Both of which are lessons learned by ISIS and Nusra from AQI, which did relatively less of all of these things.
The word they use, both Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, is Hadana Shabiya. And I think the best way to translate is one in hearts and minds. It's like to incubate. Like I think the literal translation is communal incubation or incubator.
Interesting. And then last word on Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, they created I'd say not a significant scare 2-3 years ago along the borders, but I think Hezbollah has been pretty effective, and in addition to the Lebanese army countering that. But more importantly, I'd say that this is an organization that doesn't have a constituency in Lebanon. It's that simple, and that's the most important factor. No one rose up, whether it's in Tripoli or anywhere in the north, to support the organization, even in its heyday, when it was pretty prominent in places like Arsad and others. So I think Lebanon has bigger problems they should be worried about, honestly, than ISIS at this point.
Great. Well, I wish we had more time for questions, but we don't. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists and also the ISIS War Game team.